Third part. With the first four slain, the rest of the men backed away amid much chatter. The words that reached Dee's ears were strange.
Oh, how odd. That's the language of the ancient Crystal Palace. Now, this is a noble who's on par with the sacred ancestor.
What the hoarse voice was driving at was this. The sacred ancestor, holding by far the highest position in the ancient noble society, and the elders that were the next rank had relaxed in a city of darkness, stillness, and ice at the world's northern extreme while laying plans to rule the earth. These people had conversed in a special language unknown not only to humans, but to all save those who dwelled in the Crystal Palace. This was the language of the Crystal Palace, at times taken as the word of Lord, bestowing praise and prosperity, and at other times abhorred as the devil's edicts commanding ruin and death. It was also said that the retainers of the chosen ones who gathered at the Crystal Palace spoke a rudimentary version of that tongue.
Don't kill 'em all. Leave one alive so we can ask where Gilzen...
As he listened to the hoarse voice, Dee headed back down the corridor he'd just taken. Spears assailed him from 3 directions. The men who held them wore smiles of delight on their lips. Dee displayed unbelievable speed in his movements. Split-second timing allowed him to slip between 2 spears aimed at his chest and abdomen, while the third stopped in the grip of his left hand, with the hunter sliding up the weapon's shaft as his right hand reached over his shoulder. Though he was poised to slash in a diagonal fashion, his blade limned a horizontal semicircle that mowed through the torsos of the men. Their upper halves tumbled off in whichever direction the impetus of each dictated, scattering fresh blood and entrails as they rolled across the floor. Still retaining his grip on the spear with his left hand, Dee hurled it forward. 3 of the men who were lined up farther down the corridor were impaled on it. They came at the hunter from behind, blades drawn. A heartbeat later, one reeled back, split open from head to chest, while the second and third swung their deadly weapons. Dee didn't move from his spot, and the blades appeared to sink into him. However, as the man reeled backward with a bloody gale a second later, Dee was already dashing back down the corridor in the direction he'd originally been headed. Incomprehensible words mixed with the sound of footfalls, and 4 more men were slain by the hunter's deadly blade. Undoubtedly instructions had been given to surround him and cut him down. It was a wide corridor. 10 or so of them came at Dee from either side, encircling him, but try as they might to close their ring on him, they couldn't, with Dee remaining out of reach of their swords while his blade ruthlessly and flawlessly made death the fate of each of them. He seemed to be in a critical location. Like the wind, Dee blew through a number of gates. Though lasers pierced him all over, his opponents fell victim to Dee's sword and his rough wooden needles before they could drop the hunter. Dee made no attempt to discover the means of opening and closing the gates, which were actually opened by a special key. Instead, Dee placed his left hand against the keyhole. Each opened in less than 2 seconds.
Just 1 more to go,
the hoarse voice exclaimed. The 7th gate opened. Dee halted. Just 50 yards ahead of him loomed the 8th gate, and before it were arrayed more than 30 figures. The men stood with laser rifles and traditional firearms at the ready, safeties off. From the ceiling behind them, an unknown manner of weapon was drawing a bead on Dee's heart. "Hold it right there," said a voice accented by the ancient Crystal Palace's tongue, and the whole group froze. From the source of that command the ranks of men parted, and a figure in an aqua cape stepped to the fore. Even given that our defensive formations were ill executed, you did well to make it this far, said a pale man every bit as tall as Dee. His physique was gaunt, and he had a supernatural air about him that would make those who saw him want to look away. His voice was strangely high. "Where is Gilson?" Dee inquired, and there was nothing else for him to ask. "The master is outside. He's enjoying the construction of his manse." Come to mention it, from somewhere beyond the ceiling came the sound of pounding iron and the spray of sparks from fusing metal. Though the construction methods were terribly outdated, the results were daunting to behold, with pipes dozens of yards in diameter fusing together in under a second before being joined to another and another. It was a sight Dee alone could see through the darkness. "I am Valen, a member of Duke Gilson's Sacred Protector Knights. You shall not pass." To the others he said, "The rest of you aren't to lay a hand on him." As soon as the men bowed in unison, Dee leapt into the air. His blade was over Valen's head. If he were to swing it home as he landed, it would effortlessly rip through his opponent, who stood stock still, seemingly paralyzed, as if he were water. Dee was struck by a sharp cramp. On landing, his form remained a thing of peerless beauty, but his sword slashed empty air. From a spot a few yards away, Valen smiled thinly. His voice had been rather feminine to start with, and his laughter was as well. "So you won't dodge, but you'll parry? No one ever scored 2 critical hits on me before, but there won't be a third." However, with that, Valen froze. Exactly 2 seconds later, he expelled a deep breath and wiped away the sweat that had suddenly erupted on his brow. Such an unearthly aura. Aside from the master, I've never felt the like. This makes it well worth returning to life. Dee raised his blade from where his downward stroke had left it. Its tip halted directly in line with Valen's gaze. Valen's eyes seemed to drink the glint from the steel. Or perhaps they were focused on Dee's gorgeous visage behind it. With a cry, he tumbled backward. From between the fingers clamped to his right eye there jutted a stark wooden needle. Dee's left arm had made the throw. And then the hunter leapt up over Valen, and the sword blade came down on the top of his head. Standing in front of the vermilion-stained knight who toppled backward, Dee braced himself for his next attack as he turned and looked around.
"Not much of a challenge,"
the hoarse voice informed him.
"Gilson is outside.
Let's go look for him." Making no reply, Dee approached the gate. He pressed his left hand against it. This time it took nearly 5 seconds for it to open. As soon as the gate opened, a weird presence could be sensed near the last gate he'd passed through. A rough wooden needle flew from Dee's left hand. A diminutive figure dressed from head to foot in a crimson robe took cover in the darkness a second later, vanishing from sight. Suddenly, the darkness sprang into motion. Dee's sword flashed out. Falling to his feet without a sound was the rough wooden needle, now in 2 pieces. Had the one lurking in the depths of the darkness hurled it back? Had they caught Dee's needle first? The gate behind him opened. Dee backed through it. A narrow space swallowed him, and the gate shut. It was an elevator. The hunter's left hand pressed against the inner wall, and the elevator quickly began its descent.
Hurry up. If this thing stops along the way, we're in trouble.
The hoarse voice from his left hand told him.
3,000 stories below ground. This is one hell of a setup, eh?
A green line above the door was rapidly dwindling. It was a series of flickering digits.
1,000 stories below ground. 1106. 1158.
The sensation of controlled falling came to a dead stop.
This isn't good. Now we're stuck. We're hanging in midair.
By the time the hoarse voice was done grumbling, he had already begun to take action. He reached his left hand into his coat. When it came out again, a black sphere rested in its palm.
Is that one of the mountain folks' grenades? I'm surprised the lasers didn't hit it. Stingy little pack rats will inherit the earth.
D's form flew up, and then back down again. He'd stuck the grenade to the center of the ceiling. A slim wooden needle jutted from the ceiling at an angle and ran through the grenade. The faint sound of its fuse could be heard.
You've already activated it. Being a pack rat wasn't enough. You had to be impulsive to boot.
The voice sounded almost despairing, but the span of a single breath later, the ceiling was removed by a loud and fiery blast. This was the kind of archaic device the nobility favored, and with the cables blown free along with the ceiling, like the proverbial stone, the elevator dropped 2,000 floors, with D still on board. Chapter 5 End. Chapter 6 End.